Okay. All right, let's do this. Okay, so dim the lights a little bit here. There we go. Okay, so today we're going to keep working on just talking through the unit on managing work. We get into some, I don't know, interesting stuff, I think, today. And then after this, we should get through this either end of this class or beginning of next class, and then move into kind of new management techniques, which I always think are kind of fun and interesting. Okay, so we ended off here last time, right? We're talking about how the world has kind of changed and what led us to the place we're in right now. We talked a little bit about Robert Reich's work, The Work of Nations, where basically he suggested that, this big model where you have these big bureaucracies built on, kind of ranking systems was increasingly becoming kind of outdated and unable to deal with the new global economy and how fast things moved. And he thought, right, other things would come: outsourcing, franchises, joint ventures, strategic alliances to replace it. But, bureaucracies were here to stay in lots of ways. Okay, so when it comes to kind of social inequality, right? So technology, social inequality, and how kind of managing work has changed things. One of the kind of things that's pretty clear, and Lenski argues this, is that the kind of level of technology in a society is going to determine the social stratification of that society, right? So how many people are in the kind of, poor, middle class, working class, upper class, and all of that is going to be largely dependent in some way on how a society organizes work, right? And specifically what kind of technologies are available to it. And specifically, right, the rise of the factory system, at least at first, led to a decrease in inequality eventually. So that by the time we get to kind of the period between 1945 and say about 1965, we're looking at a period of very low inequality, right? Where owners, managers still make more money than workers, but the difference between how much they make is relatively small. Okay, so why was this the case? Industrial technologies, basically, as industrialization went on, things got more complicated, right? Processes got better, things got to be more complex, and they required a more educated workforce, right? So you needed both educated managers and technical workers. After a certain point, right, you couldn't just have, people pulled off the street to come work in your factory. They needed some kind of training, and especially literacy, right, which is where we get the rise of public education in the 19th century. So as workers got more educated, right, they were at least able to read and write, and then you get this kind of college or university level kind of management class. They sort of demanded more rights, right? They saw themselves as more equal to kind of the management class, and they demanded more political rights for themselves. Now, what Lenski said was that basically, through a lot of the kind of middle part of the industrial period, and especially in this period here, it became possible for kind of your elites, right, the ownership class, if you want to call them the bourgeoisie in Marxist terms, to make a bunch of concessions without really giving up their position at the top of society. So they were able to do things like, give people better pay, shorter working hours, some kinds of benefits, pensions, and these sorts of things, and they remained quite rich. Workers were still able to do better. Now, Lenski, so technological and economic progress are kind of linked in this account. Now, Linsky's account does come from 1966. So there are obviously, he's talking kind of at the end of this, and we're talking, and then the 2010s and 2020s, and we're then talking about, periods of increasing inequality, right? We're actually get income inequality and other forms of economic inequality growing through that period. And again, it may very well be linked to kind of technology. You get the rise of things like automation, you get outsourcing to places with cheaper labor that kind of undermines, a lot of the gains made by especially the working class in this system. And we get a much different kind of stratification coming after this particular period. But at least initially, that industrial period ended with a relatively low levels of inequality. And this is a period, like if you listen to, say, someone like a Bernie Sanders, right, in the US, one of the cases that they'll make is like in the 1950s, right, workers did really well. They had, great benefits. Their share of wealth in the United States was relatively higher, but they are talking about a period, kind of, you might say, a sort of golden age, where things were a little bit different than they were before and after. So it's worth noting that as well. Okay. So Linsky's account, I think, was mostly right at the time, right? Definitely management and working class standards of living rose during the industrial period, right? And they went from very low to, by the time you hit kind of the end of say, Canada, the US as industrial nations, where they start to do that post-industrial shift, the working class, workers are in the best position that they will ever be. It's probably because the technologies required more education and still relatively large numbers of bodies to operate them. And that's probably what's changed, is as you bring in more and more automation, you still need really educated workers, but you need fewer of them. Okay. So, what do managers want to do when they introduce a new technology? So, generally speaking, one of the key goals for managers when they're bringing a new technology into the workplace, whether it's robotics, or now we're talking about AI. At one point it was computers. To bring in one computer with someone running Excel to basically replace a room full of accountants on paper ledgers. The goal is always reducing costs and boosting efficiency, or raising productivity. That's usually one of the goals. Okay, increasing flexibility. So companies are always looking for more flexibility, right? More ways that they can pivot and adapt to changing marketplaces, changing market conditions, anything that's going to give them more flexibility, more ability to pivot and change the way they're doing things definitely helps. So for instance, we'll talk more about Toyota in the next unit, but one of the things Toyota has always been known for on its, in its assembly line, especially the ones in Japan, right? When it's making cars, especially in its Japanese factories, is the flexibility of that assembly line. So Toyota is basically very simple to switch production. So let's say, I don't know, what's a Toyota vehicle? We'll say a RAV4. So they had said, 100,000 units of RAV4s were going to be produced, let's say, in the first 6 months of 2025. But what they find is that for whatever reason, the demand for RAV4s is a little bit lower than what they thought. What Toyota has done is brought in basically a way to really quickly retool their assembly line for different vehicles. Basically, they just switch the template on the robots. It's like, oh, robot, you were making a RAV4, now you're making, a Toyota Tundra, right? And they can really quickly switch it to, something that's in more demand. So that technology, right, the robotics and the ability to easily switch has allowed Toyota in a lot of cases to outperform some of their rivals. Like, for example, at Ford For Ford to switch the kind of vehicle it's making, they have to shut down the assembly line for 3 months, retool the whole system, right? Move things around, and only then can they restart production. So a lot of times, what Ford has ended up doing is producing way too much of a vehicle because it's just too costly to retool their assembly line, compared to Toyota, where they can just essentially flip a switch, right, and do it. So technologies can give flexibility. Okay. So quality, same thing. And this has been, one of the big pushes on automation. Robotics especially, is to reduce kind of human-caused problems, in manufacturing especially. Human beings get tired, they get lazy, they cut corners. Robots do not do any of those things. They just do what they're programmed to do. So in a lot of cases, right, you would put in, say, robotics to cut down on, if there's a particular process that is being done that's causing quality control issues, you put robotics in there so it does it more consistently. And I imagine AI will be used in the same way to find assembly line problems and figure out how to fix them. Okay. And then achieving greater control over operations, right? Any new technology is going to come with more controls, new ways to kind of shape the process, monitor workers, right? A lot of times, it might be, ways to monitor workers, and those are always fun. To watch people, to see what they're doing, to measure quality control and quality assurance kind of questions and all of that stuff. Okay, and yeah, usually this isn't done, no one's going in like, we're going to hurt the workers at this particular factory, we're going to put 10% of them out of work. It's just, institutional factors, particularly, right, in capitalist economies, it's all about profit. And especially once you get into shareholder capital, right, it's about quarterly profit. Because you can't even focus necessarily on the long term. You actually have to, maximize value for your investors every quarter, right? So every 3 months of the year. Okay. So what do managers actually do at the end of the day, right? So what is the role of managers? Chandler called them the visible hand. And basically he says the visible hand of the manager replaces the invisible hand of the marketplace, but their actual tasks are, to get people to do what they're supposed to do, right? There are policies laid forward by ownership, often in collaboration with upper management, and managers are there to make sure that those rules are followed. They prevent opposition to authority, right? They make sure that, troublesome workers are got rid of or disciplined. Make sure, basically, like if there's a corporate policy that employees don't like, they make sure that it gets enforced even if employees don't like to do it. And they find those spots where there's opposition to authority, or maybe people are ignoring rules or doing these informal ways of resisting, and they are the ones who are tasked with finding that. Okay, they motivate people to work hard, through a couple of things, right? You can talk carrot stick in this kind of scenario. You either praise workers and give them some kind of reward, or you punish workers for not doing the right thing, right? But always the goal of management a little bit is to try and convince workers that what they're doing is for the good of the organization, and somehow try to link it, to their own good. I remember this because I remember when I worked at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, I had a mentor, and he was really awful. He was a terrible mentor, and it was a terrible company. But I remember he took me out for lunch, because this is one of the mentorship things. And, he was trying to convince me that all of my hard work was really for my benefit. That the owners of the company, they had plenty of money. They didn't need any more money. But that really, I was just benefiting myself by working hard, right? What was good for me was good for the company. And, or what was good for the company was good for me too. And then I asked for a raise and he said no. So I'm like, well, if they have enough money already, then, it wouldn't hurt to give me like a 50-cent raise per hour. And he said no. So that went well. But right, this is the goal of management, is to make you think what you're doing is for the good of the organization, which benefits you as well. And yeah, motivate workers to achieve quantity and quality of work output deemed necessary, right? So a lot of management goals is quotas, right? Making sure your production's up, right? How many barrels of oil are you getting out of the ground? How many cars are you producing, right? How much, and is it being done safely and at a high quality and all of those things, right? And I mean, if you talk about things like the auto industry in particular, you want to make sure that you get as few recalls on a product as possible because you don't want to have to pay for recalls. Okay. And then just planning, right? The day-to-day coordinating, organizational change and making kind of day-to-day decisions. That's, obviously things that are part of kind of daily life for managers. It's just figuring out the day-to-day things, making decisions about production, about staffing, about all of those things. And our management ideology, right? Basically, managers, because of their higher incomes, that kind of gives them the right to give orders to other people, and what they say is justified because they've been put in that kind of position. And that's the sort of management ethos. Oh, I'm looking at the Dilbert cartoon. Okay. Oh, all right. Now here's the one that I find fun. Okay. So, scientific management. Sometimes also referred to as Taylorism. So, as we get into the industrial period, right, and we're also in the period of kind of, the Enlightenment has, we've gone through the Enlightenment, we're going through the Industrial Revolution. So there is a really high kind of belief that science and human reason can solve any sort of human problem, right? And so when it comes to, you get the kind of nascent factory system, basically people start to think, okay, how could we use science to make the factory work better? And one of the people that comes into this debate is Frederick Winslow Taylor, who basically, so he's an American or a steel worker who rises to the influential position of business consultant, and in a lot of ways tries to remake the workplace along scientific grounds. So how would you do this, right? One of the things that Taylor wants to do, I always want to call him Winslow for some reason, but his name is Taylor. One of the things that Taylor wants to do is basically conduct experiments, right? So he wants to use the scientific method to basically test what is the best way to organize workflows and workspaces to maximize what you're going to get out of out of a worker, how to get the most out of them in the least amount of time, right? So, he was a critic of traditional management approaches to that time because he said they were not scientific and they didn't account for human nature. And he has a very particular notion of human nature. And his big thing was he developed time and motion studies to improve worker efficiencies. And that was basically, the following. In any sort of scenario, like where you're producing something, you would set up a number of different workflows, right? And then you would test which one was the most efficient, like which one got the work done the quickest, and you would go with that. And that's where I said, I'm going to draw on Taylor's face here. Your kitchen today is largely a function of time and motion studies, because people took this, right? He publishes his book in 1911 and it becomes a very popular philosophy, and people all over the place start to think, how can I apply this to all sorts of spaces? And one is, the kitchen. Okay, so this is our stove, right? This is kind of my kitchen. This is what my kitchen looks like. This is the sink, right? And I have an island here. So the idea, in kind of Taylorist notions of how a kitchen should be organized is that I want to be able to cook, clean, so basically prepare. So this is my island. So this is where I chop my vegetables, right? Cook, this is the stove, right? and this is the sink where I wash things, minimizing the amount of motion through that space, right? Because anytime that I have to, say, I don't know, walk over here to get like a knife, or, so my fridge is right by the sink, right? So anytime I have to like walk all the way over there, I lose a little bit of time. So the idea is to try and keep people in a kind of triangle, right? So I'm going to draw that in green so you can see it better. Taylorist ideas, it's not Taylor that came up with it, was to keep the person doing domestic work in this little triangle for as much of the time, so that basically you can do this okay, you turn around, chop your vegetables, bring them to the stove, put them on, cook them, take whatever dishes you have, take one step over, wash your dishes in the sink, right? With a minimum of wasted time and motion, right? So your implements are going to be here, your knives and stuff. I don't know, that space is kind of a dead space where we put the toaster. But the idea is, right, you kind of try to minimize how much motion there is so that you do the least amount of task switching and the least amount of wandering over here, wandering over there. And this is all based on this idea of scientific management. So people have applied this to all sorts of sort of parts of life. Mostly work, but people were like, okay, well, how can we make, the stay-at-home mom cooking dinner more efficient as well? Because we are talking about the 1910s, right? So, okay, so Taylor, what were some of his key principles? So he assumed that workers were lazy, right? So he had a very particular notion of human nature. And he said basically, people don't want to work. People want to be lazy and do as little as possible. And so they'll slow down output, right? They'll actually make as little as possible. Let's say you set a quota, right? You need 10 widgets produced. They probably could produce 15 widgets, but they're going to make sure that they slow that process down so they produce 10 widgets because they're lazy, and those extra 15 widgets are an extra bit of work. Okay, so Taylor, suggested using time and motion studies to identify the best ways to do a job, right? You want to figure out the single best way to do it, and to separate conception from execution, right? That basically you needed to think less about conceptually how things were going to do work. You needed to actually just focus on how things are actually executed. Okay. Also had, and these are keys, scientific selection of workers and equipment. So you would test which workers were best, which ones could do particular jobs the best. If there were particular types of, kind of people that were more suited to do particular types of jobs, you put them in those kinds of jobs. And then, instead of a salary or a wage, right? Taylor did not like those. He basically said that you should motivate workers with, economic rewards, but specifically, he wanted to do piece rate payment with bonuses for extra production. So instead of paying you, you show up to the factory at 8 in the morning, you punch your time card, or swipe in or whatever, right? And then you stay there until 4 o'clock, and whatever you produce in that time, you produce, and you get paid your daily wage, right? Taylor was like, well, instead of doing that, why don't we say we'll pay, for every completed widget, right? For every completed car, the workers will get X. And the idea was, obviously, that people would work harder and faster if they could earn more from doing more, and if they knew they would earn less from doing less, right? So let's say you only produce 5 widgets that day, right? You only get paid half of what you would have gotten paid if you produced 10 widgets, and a third of what you would get if you produced 15 widgets. So you'd be motivated to work that much harder, according to Taylor, to basically, get as much money for yourself. So human nature, so people are lazy, but they're also self-interested, right? That's another key. And this is, again, you can see a kind of Adam Smith, greed is good kind of notion in here, right? That basically people are self-interested, and from that, if you can harness that self-interest, you can increase production. Okay, and yeah, so this is, if you remember that Charlie Chaplin video, I will not show it to you again. from the beginning of the course, right? The modern times where chaplain is like working on that assembly line. That's a kind of Taylorist way of doing things, right? That is very much organized, so people didn't have to move, right? The work came to them. They did those repeated tasks without changing tools, and they did them very quickly, right? So you could ramp up the speed of the assembly line. Okay, so Taylorism is still with us in a lot of ways, right? There's a particular mode of production that's referred to as lean production. And before they had all their manufacturing problems, one of the lead kind of proponents of this, and they were highly praised for it, was Boeing. Right now, Boeing, makes planes where the doors fall off. But a few years ago, that's okay. It's very rare, but it happened at least once. Boeing. Try that again. Boeing was very much known for this kind of what's called lean production, which basically was the same idea, right? Was that, in the construction of an airframe, right, in the plane, the 747 or whatever, they had stripped all of the processes down so that there was a minimum of things like moving around, tool switching, that people were very much doing things in the most rationalized way possible. And this is a sort of, Fordist form of Taylorism, right? Where you've now moved into like the production of really complex goods on assembly lines using these really like scientific processes to try and reduce the amount of time that's lost in things like, I have to go get a wrench, right? I'm sure, I don't know how many wrenches are used in the production of a Boeing, probably more sophisticated than that, but whatever you need, right? You try to make sure that everything's set. So Boeing very famously, right, every night they have a crew, and their whole job of that crew is to get all of the tools and supplies set for the next day, so that when the worker shows up to build that airframe, that 747 the next day, everything's there and they don't have to move around. And it's cheaper apparently to pay someone to gather all the supplies and make sure everything's there for the next day than for people to wander around the factory floor being like, sorry, I need a, self-locking bolt or something like that. Okay, so we see this in the service sector as well, particularly in sectors like fast food, right, where people have detailed job descriptions, you have planned workflows, motion studies have influenced a lot of that. Yeah, if you go into the kitchen, like any industrial kitchen, right, any kitchen at say like a Boston Pizza or at a Earl's or some big chain, they're very much organized around these sorts of things too, right? Everybody has a job, right? Everybody is doing a particular thing, right? They know what they're doing. They know what they're responding to on the screens in terms of the orders. And there's really detailed flows, right? And think of it like a McDonald's kitchen. Every single person in that kitchen has a specific job, right? This person is the one cooking the burgers. This one's the one cooking the fries, assembling the burgers, wrapping them, right? The whole process is split up and rationalized in a way that it flows through that whole kitchen and food gets produced really, really quickly. Burger King had this system called speed of service, basically meaning, they had a system set up. Can't imagine who eats at Burger King, but I'm sure someone does. Where it was set up again so that you would get the idea was, I think you would get your order within 3 minutes, right? From order to receiving it was 3 minutes. And then when we talk about things like building cleaners, sometimes building cleaning, not U of A's building cleaners, at least not for Torrey. There's a stairwell I think when you get up to the 6th floor of Torrey, there's a sign that says this stairwell has not been swept in 72 days at this point. But other places, right, they split building cleaning into zones, right? So that rather than one person going into say a classroom at a school and doing everything, they do one thing, right? So they go in, they wash the floors, they leave. Someone else comes in, they wash the desks, they leave. Everybody and they move around in zones, right? So at like 9 p.m., it's like zone 1 goes into this part of the building, and they kind of rotate around till everything's clean, right? So you see that a lot. Okay, for obvious reasons too, when put into a kind of Fordist environment, a lot of people find them incredibly restrictive. And so there's been lots of worker pushback to Taylorist practices, right? These highly rationalized things where, everything is like output measurement. Basically you are, being judged all the time for how quickly you produce things. People don't really love these systems. And these systems tend to be high stress, high burnout, and extremely prone to injury. Because people, especially when you get into things like piecework, people being paid for higher production rates, people will rush through processes in order to get things done as quickly as possible, risking working in unsafe ways as well. Okay. Let's check where I'm at here. Okay. So obviously, not everyone in every workplace has ever embraced Taylorism, right? And definitely in some workplaces it worked, in other places it didn't. But people don't like it. Like, generally speaking, people don't like these highly methodical, highly scientific kind of work routines. And so I think the school that has more or less gained dominance in our kind of modern workplaces, though we still have Taylorist practices around, especially in things like manufacturing and fast food, is the human relations school or the human relations movement. And right, you see this now because most places will have an HR department that's tasked with managing kind of employee satisfaction and working conditions, especially making sure that things comply with laws that have been put in place to stop some of the worst sort of, Taylorist abuses in the workplace. Okay, so what is human relations movement? Basically, it says, what we need is a humane treatment of employees, treating them less as cogs in a machine, more like human beings. And that this, by cooperating with them, you could actually increase productivity as well. Now, again, this has not always been sort of universally accepted, but it seems to have kind of won the day in terms of, everywhere has a human relations department now, or an HR department, right? So they shifted the control from utilitarian, right? One that's really focused on outputs and sort of outcomes, and the idea of like, okay, what's good for the company is going to be good for everyone, right? The good of the many outweighs the needs of the few, to a more normative control, setting rules and regulations to try and govern workplaces in humane ways. Okay, and yeah, you see this starting in the 1920s, right? Corporate or welfare or industrial betterment programs, trying to make people happier in work, tried to reduce things like turnover and all of that stuff. And part of it was by giving, benefits to workers, things like, recreation facilities, like a gym at your workplace, or access to recreation facilities, better work environments, medical care, right? So from this is especially true in the US, right? So if you think about it, one of the things that is true of the US today is you get your health care, right, in a lot of cases from your employer, right? So you'll get a benefits plan from your employer that includes medical care. This actually comes out of this human relations movement, where it's like, okay, how do we make workers happier? Well, we'll include medical care, right? We'll give them benefits that include, we'll pay for doctor's visits and hospitalization and all of that stuff. Now, obviously, Canada went a different way with this by essentially universalizing medical care, but we still have things like dental benefits and other healthcare benefits built in. And again, the idea is if your employer provides those things to you, you'll be a happier worker. I'll say, like a couple of years ago when the academic union on campus, it's called OSHWA, was negotiating benefits with the University of Alberta, they had an absolutely terrible psychological benefits, right? So accessing like therapy and psychological care was terrible. And that was like the number one thing that employees wanted was better access to that through benefits. And, you know, it was like, you could choose from these 5 people you could go to. It was really bad. And now it's open and we can do whatever we want. But that's this human relations kind of notion, right? We get, you know, things. And then personnel policies, things like harassment policies, you know, rules governing, you know, conflict within the workplace, who gets hired, who gets promoted, right? Making it really rules bound helps a lot as well. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, corporate welfare, industrial betterment basically was all about, you know, treating workers like human beings, not as sort of mechanistic parts that could be swapped out. You wanted to make them happy and therefore more productive. And this person whose name I've never been able to pronounce, I think it's Amitai Etzioni, an Italian work theorist, basically says, you know, compliance, you know, can be achieved in a couple of ways. So the first one is obviously coercive, right? Penalties and harsh discipline can be used in order to kind of help or push forward corporate policies. If people aren't following it, you fire them, you punish them in some way. Utilitarian, you emphasize pay and material benefits, right? So why are you going to come to this job? Well, we're going to make it worth your while. What's good for the company is good for you, because if you produce 15 widgets, you get 15 widgets worth of pay. And then the normative one, kind of rules and regulations, but with the idea of having the workers align their own interests with organizational goals. When we get into new management techniques, we'll see this a little bit more. Things like workers' cooperatives or giving workers a say in the management of companies has been, you know, a big part of these kind of normative goals. You know, so I'll put co-op here. Worker cooperatives, they're not super common anymore. They were really common for a period of time. And you still see some in places like Germany where workers are given, you know, seats on the boards of companies, right? Where, you know, at least some of the management decisions get made by workers as well. How many chapters do we have left to cover for the final? And is the date on Bear Tracks for the final April 14th? I would have to look on Bear Tracks, which I will do for next time. That sounds correct to me. Ooh, I don't know if I have my file explorer open. Like, these units are short, and we may not get through all of them. We're going to do our best. Oh, hang on. I haven't made those slides yet. So, yeah, we'll probably look new management techniques, unions, and then satisfaction and stress are technically one unit. I just split them into separate things. So new management techniques, unions, and then work satisfaction and stress. So 3, maybe optimistically, that last one might get cut. So 2 for sure, 3 optimistically, but they're all very short, I promise. And I will check the date of the exam. I just don't want to go into Bear Tracks right now, but that sounds right. Okay. And can I get this done in 10 minutes? Oh, I'm sure I can. I got 3 slides after. Okay. So this is an interesting kind of, I don't know, piece of trivia, but also tells us a lot about workers. So in Chicago, in the late 20s, early 30s, I guess the 1920s, early 30s, because I guess we're getting into 2020. We're in the 2020s. We'll be in the 2030s before you know it. They did these series of studies at Western Electric's Hawthorne plant in Chicago, right? And basically, they were trying to figure out what helped people be more productive, reduced fatigue, increased productivity, made workers happier, all of these sorts of things, right? So this is very much a sort of Taylorist study. They wanted to use science to come up to figure out what made workers work better. So they did all sorts of things, right? They focused on the effects of fatigue and monotony by giving people rest breaks, by adjusting the lighting, and all of these sorts of things. So in some sense, right, your coffee break and whatever lunch break you have, right, to some extent, owe their existence to things like the Hawthorne studies. Because it was like, okay, what if we give people, a 15-minute break in the morning and a 15-minute break in the afternoon, to get a little snack and have a coffee or whatever it happens to be, right? Have a cigarette, all of these sorts of things. What would be the effect on productivity, right? Giving people short rest breaks during the day, and how many, right? And they experimented with 2, 3, 5, 10, right? And just to see what the effects were. Now, the findings are weird of the Hawthorne studies, particularly because they did all sorts of things, right? Like, so they adjusted the lighting. And one of the things they kind of found really early in the Hawthorne studies was that the workers knew that they were being experimented on, right? They knew that something was happening because, they were being given these different breaks. The lights were being turned up and turned down, at different times just to see what the effects were. And basically, what they found in almost all cases, when they brought in some kind of change, there was a positive impact on productivity for a little while, right? So at one point in the Hawthorne studies, they had turned down the lights in the factory so low that you could barely see, right? It was so dark in the factory that workers could barely see what they were doing, but they still noticed a small jump in productivity. And this is what's called a Hawthorne effect. And it was basically that the workers had sort of realized that management was doing things to try and improve working conditions. And just out of the sort of like gratitude for the fact that management cared, when they noticed a change, they worked a little bit harder, right? So that's what you call Hawthorne effect. Just the interest had positive results, right? So just showing interest in trying to make your workers' lives better caused productivity rates to spike, at least temporarily. Okay. And they did things like, informal group norms. They found that informal group norms were critical, right? So that within these workplaces, quotas set by management were helpful, but within the group, right, groups reacted poorly to what they called rate busters, right? People who worked less hard to slow down work to basically the pace of the slowest worker, right? They were the slowest worker, or they worked slower to try and slow everyone's pace down. And what actually worked really well was letting the group sort of set its own quotas and punish, people who weren't meeting them. Okay, so what does Hawthorne tell us? Workers' needs are important, and just addressing them in any way, through experimentation can help. And just workers knowing that management cares about their well-being is ultimately helpful. And then the training of managers to recognize this and work with workers is helpful as well. Okay, so the kind of ideas behind human relations theory: workers want to cooperate. Most people want to do a good job, right? Most people want to be at work and be contributing in some way. So again, think of this as opposed to Taylorism, right? Taylorism said that workers are lazy, right? So they're kind of against their management. Human relations theory says no. People want to work and they want to cooperate. Their attitudes, values, emotions, psychological needs, their relationships shape their work behavior, right? So in order to make work the best, you should try to make those conditions as good as possible, right? Make people feel good, meet their psychological needs, make sure that workplaces run well interpersonally, that you're minimizing kind of problems. Okay, and modern workplaces, Mayo says, are a microcosm of larger society. The goal should be to treat workers well, and that human relationships need to be valued, right? We're not automatons, we're not robots. And so if you want, if you're fighting with your boss, if you hate your boss, you're not going to work as hard. If you can minimize those, if you treat people well and you minimize those problems, you'll hold on to people longer and they will work better for you. All right. Oh, that's really small text. Okay. So Maslow's theory of X and Y. I'll try to do this really quickly. So theory X, We have our pessimistic assumption of the average worker. And basically, it's a management style that says that your average worker is this guy, right? He doesn't want to do stuff. He's closed off, right? That's what the X is. His arms are closed off. He has no ambition, shies away from work and responsibilities. And basically, the goal of managers in style X is to sort of force lazy employees to work harder, right? And so this is your standard Taylorist account. Your theory Y, this is your human relations account, basically says, managers will make assumptions that the people in their workforce are internally motivated. They want to work, right? And that company gives them an opportunity to express themselves in terms of work, to better their lives, through work and earning a wage. And they can work this way without needing like a direct reward, right? They don't need a cookie or a monetary bonus or anything like that. So theory why employers, right, think that their employees are considered the most valuable asset to the places they work. And basically their goal is to keep people around, make their lives better, improve themselves in any way possible. So these are our kind of two theories. And what you want typically in human relations is your theory Y manager, right? You want someone who wants to create cooperation with workers to get the most out of it. Okay, now obviously human relations theory, has trouble taking into account a couple things, inequality in power and pay. Managers, you could say you want to cooperate with workers, but managers are always in that dominant position, right? They are the powerful ones in the relationship. And workplace conflict, especially between workers and management, can be hard, to deal with. And sometimes, workplace conflict causes a Y, to go to an X, and suddenly you have a worker who doesn't want to cooperate. And this, by human relations kind of theory, basically has to be dealt with by mitigating interpersonal conflict, which obviously can be really difficult. Okay, that is that. So we will start on new management techniques next time. So we'll do that on Wednesday. And, we are approaching the end of the course rapidly. See you